And so, and they know a little bit about you based on your bio. What
Yeah.
I'd love to know is, what do you want to tell us that's not in your bio?
The thing that I would tell you about me as a writer that is not in my bio is that we all come to life with certain biases and prejudices. And mine is that I am always prejudiced against people who had it easy and who had everything taken care of for them. So I am always looking to give the slight insider advantage to the underdog, to anybody who had to go to work right away, to anybody who found themselves in a caretaker role at a very young age and had to put their dreams and ambitions aside, to anybody who had to do day jobs that they didn't want to do or even necessarily tell people about or
Right.
share.
Right.
I'm here for them because I feel like they are my people.
Mm-hmm.
So there's always the subtext of trying to view it from the point of view of somebody who's an outsider and who had to work twice as hard to gain half as much. Mm-hmm. That can be gender, that can be race, that can be sexual orientation, can be gender identification, can be educational background, it can be class, it can be ability. I'm always looking forward to give them a little bit of a lift. So that is the inside secret.
And you know what? I think that's probably in some ways kind of how we, bonded, you know what I mean? Because obviously I feel the same way. And the trick in even getting an MFA is that nobody cares, at least for me personally, how I got to that point, what it took for me to get there, what it took for me to get it. You know what I mean? It's just, oh, you have an MFA, so it was easier. No. I still don't have a high school diploma to this day right now. Still don't. So I love that you say that. I love that that's where you're coming from. And that's really who I like to speak to as well, because it is important. And that's why I like to do these interviews, and also for students of the world, not just my students, but just of the world, to see, what did it take for you to become who you are? How do you exist in your day-to-day? How do you, just how are you, and who is Lily? You know what I mean? How did Lily come to be outside of being a writer? And that's some of the things that I think are really important, because there's a lot of messages that come out of, like you said, just telling your story and just people finding out a little bit about you and what it took for you to get here. So that's really what I want to get into today is, I have told my students how I came to know you was when I was stationed, we were first stationed at West Point. I think it was 2008, and just having a difficult time. And I think I found out about your book, I Love a Man in Uniform, and read it and just thought, I love her. You know what I mean? Like, I just love her. But that was kind of like, I just felt so out of my space, and just everything that was familiar. And that book really, really helped me. And that's really kind of how I came to know you. But in all of your writing and what you share on social media and all of that, I mean, you're just such a real person, which I know sounds cliche, but I mean, that's my word. I'm using it, real, right?
Yeah.
And I love it. And like I said, then we have all these things in common. So yeah, let's talk about, some of that. Let's talk about how you became Lily.
Wow, that's an interesting question, because my parents named me something else, and I never use it. It's only like my legal documentation, whatever. But yeah, when I was a teenager, I kind of was lost, really tried to do like the regular girl thing, and wasn't one of the popular kids, but I was in drama club, which always portends a certain future, right? Like, it's like this sort of hyper expressive nerd realm. But it was right about the time that punk rock and goth music was exploding, and I managed to discover it. And Lily literally came into being probably when I was like 15 or so. I started calling myself Lily, dressed like a little ghouly vampire, use like literally circus clown makeup to make my face like super pasty before I would go to school, do my black eyeliner on the bus. And punk music and goth music literally saved my life, because what they did was they took somebody who didn't feel at home in this world, the 3D everyday world, and gave me an alternate reality to live in. And it was such a balm to me to find that everybody in this world felt like a misfit. And everybody in this world questioned authority. And in the punk realm, they were very political, sort of lefty politics. And in the goth world, it was lots of sort of romantic aesthetics and moodiness and, you know, blood and guts and romance. And it was kind of the two cultures kind of came together to give me a pathway out of this day-to-day life that was very, very miserable. So that's how I came to be. And in both worlds, there's active fanzine culture where you can, you know, write show reviews or expound in your teenage way on politics. And it gave me opportunity to actually start writing. And those were the first places that I published my work, was in little punk fanzines that were, you know, copied at a copy shop, collated by the person who was publishing them, and then stapled and handed out at punk shows. So this was not exactly, you know, from there to the Atlantic and the New York Times was a rather lengthy course. And I certainly couldn't predicted it when I started. But the reason why I started writing was because it gave me a way to express myself in a world where I felt continually silenced. And I didn't have some grand plan to become a huge successful writer or write in these publications. That wasn't the point. The point was to treat writing as a how would I say it? As a life raft to keep me afloat in waters that felt very treacherous to me.
I love that. You know, wait, and I want to go back a little bit because you use the term punk, right? And yeah, I was a wannabe punk rocker, as strange as that may sound. Growing up in Pasadena, California, I just loved. I still love all kinds of music, you know. But I hate, well, because you're Black, you can only like, you know, rap, or you can only like R&B or whatever. And I liked punk rock music. And I said something to my daughter the other day, who's about to turn 16, and she's like, "What is that? What is a punk rocker?" And I was like, "Well, you know, like, we called it like the Goths or like the Death Rockers. You know, they had all these different names in the 80s and 90s. And she's like, "I don't know what you're talking about." So I mean, I'm assuming anyone—
So painful. It's so painful.
It's like, right. I'm assuming everyone knows. I'm like, hello. So I'm guessing for those of us who wouldn't know, or students watching that would not know, what exactly is that? What is that culture? What, you know, just talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, a vampire and gave it a box of crayons, basically, and some instruments, and all this sort of fascination with the aesthetics and trappings of, you know, the vampires, the underworld, mysticism, the occult. And there's an anthemic song that came out when I was a kid by a band called Ministry, called Every Day is Halloween. And it's all about sort of going through the world as a goth. And, you know, it really is true that for goths, every day kind of is Halloween. You sort of live in this kind of lovely escapist, you know, there are some people who are always looking for the sun, and goths are always kind of looking for the moonlight. And it's just kind of how you orient yourself. I'm, you know, this is like 30 years later, I still wear head to toe black every day. Yeah, exactly. It's my uniform. And it's like, it's hard to leave behind. I mean, Halloween is still my favorite holiday, and I love seeing goth culture has transcended generations, believe it or not. It's still a counterculture, so you don't see it everywhere. But, you know, there are people who are, you know, in their teens now who are still working that look, and they shop at Hot Topic at the mall, which we could not do because it didn't exist. But it is kind of become an industry in itself. Like, you can mail order on Amazon a coffin purse. Like, that just blows my mind. So, and then punk rock is just kind of, you know, loud, ugly, anti-authoritarian, you know, 3 chords and aggression. And Dead Kennedys, Sex Pistols. You were lucky you lived in California. California 80s hardcore is the best. Bad Religion, you know, Alternative Tentacles, Dead Kennedys, Circle Jerks, Bad Religion, Social Distortion, my absolute favorite. Descendants, man, they really put the pin in the map. I was much more into California hardcore, even though I lived in New Jersey. So it was just California punk was a little more musical, and it was a little more political in a way that I related to. I mean, I love the Ramones, but we wouldn't necessarily call them a political band. And then there was a lot of, in the New York punk scene, a lot of like Super Dude, Skinhead, little more right wing, certainly very sexist, and I was just not having it. California was my dream, so it was no surprise. I moved to San Francisco when I was 21, so I could get out there, and you had to be 21 to go to most of the shows I wanted to see. So yeah, I hit Valhalla punk rock wise in San Francisco. Long-winded answer.
No, that's not. I mean, I love it because like you said, I mean, I shouldn't say we, I assume that, you know, people just know so much about various cultures and sometimes they just don't, you know, but even when I use the term punk rock or punk rocker, oftentimes people are looking at me like they don't know what I'm talking about. I'm thinking, who are you? Where are you from that you don't know what this means?
I know.
But it's just not a universal term anymore.
It's really not. And I do think it's important to just tell these background stories, because what people will come to discover as they approach their own writing and get to know the lives of other writers is that your culture really should inform your writing, your politics, your rituals, your family, your customs. And that can be your ethnicity. It can be where you grew up. It can be, in my case, the culture of music and aesthetics. These are all things that can, and in my view, should inform the work that you do. There is something of a prevailing, very archaic mentality in writing, where if you're a reporter, you should be a reporter with a small r, not a writer with a capital W, meaning that the best reporters keep their own lives and their own point of view out of it. I do not think that is true. My path to my version of success has been the opposite. That's not to say everything that I write is first person. It certainly isn't. I do a lot of reporting. However, my worldview is pretty present. And I really hope that not everybody shares this goal, but my goal is that if somebody who reads my writing meets me in person, I'm consistent with who they think I am. And that has really been something that has come to be. Like, you're probably not surprised that this is the first time we're meeting face to face. You're like, oh, she seems like kind of what I thought she'd be like, right? And I like that, because I like stories where even if it is a reported feature where we don't hear one jot of the writer's life, you get a real sense of who is the narrator of the story. What are they presenting? What do they bring? There are venues where that is not useful. There are certain publications that don't want that, and you can remove it. But in the contexts and publications where you can put it in, I find that tremendously rewarding, and more now as we are slowly, grindingly broadening who we are allowing inside the gates.
Right.
They're making really meaningful change because they refuse to edit out their own lens of how they perceive what they've observed. I think it's very, it's kind of a delicious time to be reading nonfiction, because we're seeing so much stuff that is not necessarily personal writing, but personally informed.
Right. And you know what, and I mean, and that's kind of perfect for the purpose of this class in particular, because, you know, all of the students are pursuing media in some way. Some want to write, you know, like they want to publish a book or whatnot. Some want to be a podcaster. Some are podcasting already, have their own YouTube channels, video journalism, you know, I mean, there's just all of these aspects of media. And similar to what you just said, for a while, I felt like every editor I worked with didn't want to hear what Sharisse felt or what Sharisse thought or what Sharisse's take was on this thing. And but that's kind of the only way I know how to write. I mean, I'm just not one of those skilled writers that I can do. I have to go through my lens, view it through my lens, speak it the way that I, you know, and so, and it's just an interesting time, I think, to be entering into this field where on one hand, like you said, you can do just that. But I mean, depending on what way they go, maybe they might have somebody that kind of tries to stifle them or don't say that, don't, you know, publish that. So, I mean, what do you say to them?
I would say that now more than ever, there is a broad range of different venues that you can present your writing. If you want to do something super voicey, if you want to do something super personality driven, if you always want it to be your take, there's podcasts, there's YouTube channels, there's TikTok, there's Instagram reels. It's democratized in that regard.
Right.
And I think it's very important because what we accept as objective reporting is typically a white male, heterosexual, middle class point of view. That's what we think is reality, objectivity. And I would say in the last 10 years, we've really seen that actively challenged. And I've seen the op-ed pages at these august publications broaden out simply because they're getting called out repeatedly by people saying, just because you say that your middle of the road milquetoast point of view is reality does not mean that is true, because people do bring receipts. They're like, you know, here's the way voices have been excluded. Here's your percentage on gender. Here's your percentage in lack of representation of women of color. And here's your lack of representation in people who, you know, across class strata. And after a certain point, you know, they can't ignore it. The smiling white male faces coming out of those, you know, contributor pages, it can be pretty glaring after a certain point of view, certain point in time rather. So I do think that if you are somebody who, like us, is very, find it's just easier to be productive and generative and finds it easier to get into a story through your own point of view, stick with the winners, man. If that's what works for you, start out there. Honestly, writing is intimidating enough as it is. Go with what works. And then later, if you get an itch to experiment, or somebody says, I can only do this if it's more objective, and you feel like it, then fine. But the point is to just get started, right? Get started. Because even many years into your career, inertia issues can be a tremendous obstacle at all times. It's not like I'm 30 years into this now and I just like get up every day and flow. I really don't. And there are some stories that I've simply had to put down because I can only tell it one way and this publication won't want it. Or they want me to present a certain angle that I don't feel good about. Or I've even had stories that I've turned in and an editor completely rewrote it. It didn't sound like anything that I would ever say. And I just took it back. So get started. Start with what feels natural for you to get the words on the page, because in a very varied media landscape where you have this traditional legacy media and you have like celebrity profiles and first person articles and essays and blogs and TikTok, there is ample opportunity for you to find your niche. And it can certainly change over time, but for gosh sakes, get started someplace where you feel comfortable, because even with it, or the most comfortable, because there's going to be discomfort no matter what. I feel that's very important to point out, because I believed in the beginning that there were writers who just got up and did it and it flowed. And what I have found is even people who have won the big awards that you've heard about constantly wrestle with self-doubt and inertia. So it is constant, and it is not a rookie problem. Please remember that and do whatever it takes to get the words on the page.
Well, you know what, you couldn't have said it better, because that is true, because I think a lot of times that does happen, right? We see someone in our eyes that is successful, you know, success means to us, because obviously it's different for everyone. But yeah, like, oh my gosh, Stephen King, he's just going to sit down and he's just going to write another, you know what I mean? Or whatever, who we're idolizing. And so much of that is just not true. It is, I think one of the hardest things to do is write. In nonfiction in particular, because you are giving of yourself. I mean, if you're writing memoir, you're giving of yourself. I think for me, it was really hard for people to doubt what I was saying. It's like,
oh God, yeah, absolutely.
Are you telling me this has not happened, or this is not true, or whatever? So, I mean, I really do think that it takes a lot of guts and a lot of, I mean, just balls, you know what I mean, to write nonfiction in particular. But like you said, the most important thing is just to get started, because if you get hung up on the who's and the what's, and they're not going to like it, and I can't, and whatever, then you'll never do it, right? So, I mean, I love that you say that. But you mentioned that you're writing kind of, you know, different, you know, you're reporting, we know you've written memoir, things like that. What are you kind of working on right now? Are you writing another book? Are you like, where are you at right now with your career?
I'm at an interesting crossroads because I recently published my first piece about my challenges with mental health issues, which is, in my case, I have like sort of this Easter basket of like anxiety, depression, complex post-traumatic stress disorder from my childhood. And then I recently got diagnosed with distracted type attention deficit disorder. And that was like, I was sort of ready to have content to have my little cluster of just regular old mental health issues, but then I had this neurodiversity thing kind of drop like an Acme safe, crushing the IoT in the cartoons. And it's just a lot to process. So I published a piece in the Times, just kind of very cautiously testing the waters, and it did way better than I would have expected. So as you know, somebody who's written very personal stuff yourself, it sounds like that would be a total win, but coming along with the success of people reading it is this feeling of being exposed in a way that, you know, part of how you trick yourself into writing is, I'll just write this for myself and slide it out there. Right. And then when you realize that thousands of eyeballs have seen it, there is something of a bit of an emotional whiplash of like, so I'm kind of sitting quietly with, do I want to try to turn it into a book, knowing that anytime you write something personal, people do doubt, you know, they do tend to disbelieve what you're saying. There's sort of predictable blowback you're going to get. Right. One is, how dare you put yourself in the center of your story, especially if you're female. Is this even true? Are you just saying this for attention, which is just weird? It's like, there are many more simple ways to get attention in the world. If you brought it to a movie theater and scream fire, it would be easier and frankly less chaotic. You know, and, you know, what does your family think, blah, blah, blah. So knowing that that is a fairly predictable cul-de-sac you're going to be driving around in if you do it, I'm just sort of sitting and trying to figure out if the next book I want to write is something that is informed by what is it like to go through the world as a woman, dealing, as most of us are, very privately with mental illness. And I don't know, I have to kind of feel my way. And I think that that is a piece of advice that I would extend now to nonfiction writers who are looking to mine their own lives for material, is to go slow. Because there is a lot of very frequently parroted advice of, you got to open a vein and bleed across the page and put it all on the table and spill your guts out. And it's like, that's very easy advice for somebody to give. But what that leaves out of the conversation is that we can re-traumatize ourselves if we make things public that we're not quite ready for. Right. Now, what you can do for yourself as an exercise is separate the writing of the thing from the publishing of the thing, because the writing of the thing can be private for all time. Right. But once it's public, it leaves your hands and becomes something you can't predict. And that, for me, has been where the whiplash has come in, of just being like, I don't know if you were shocked to find that people didn't believe you. But that is very shocking for me personally. I'm like, why would I lie about this? I'm gonna lie, it's gonna be about my weight or my age or money I have. Like, I am a size 2 millionaire, just deigning to talk to you boring people. But whatever, you know, it's like, I'm just like, if I was gonna lie, I'd make myself look a lot better. Right, I get it. So anyway, yes, if you're mining your own life for material, I'm gonna give you advice, which only recently did somebody give to me, which is slow down. Particularly, I think, if we are very independent people who, as a trauma response, have been used to taking care of ourselves, we tend to push ourselves to succeed, to prevail, to endure, to persevere. And one thing we love to push ourselves to do as hardworking trauma survivors is to push ourselves to overcome the trauma, which we can misinterpret to mean, let me publish this piece of writing that's very personal and very painful, because then that means I won. Right. That is actually a false construct. The way to win with your trauma is, don't try to tell the trauma what's what and grind it into the ground by publishing it. That's not really winning it. That's just changing your position in your dance with your trauma. Slow down. You've got time. That's another trauma response that I noticed that a lot of us have, especially as people who, as a result of our trauma, are very self-sufficient and very independent and very prone to proving ourselves is we always think it has to be done very quickly. We have to hurry this along. We got to show the world we can do this. We got to get our writing out there, you know, and it's actually part of the fight response, believe it or not. I'm going to fight this trauma and win by turning it into art right now. And I better go before I lose my nerve. And it's like, my dudes, I love you. I get where you're coming from. You want to turn this, you know, you want to dig through this heap of horse poop to find the pony. I get it. I totally get it. But bear in mind that you can slow down, because writing about, you know, your trauma, your background, your family secrets, your secret past, that marriage you never told anybody about, whatever, and making it public are two totally different exercises. By all means, record your story in haste. Write it down, you know, set up your reel before you hit share, etc. Do all the things, but definitely take a pause before you make it public. Because once it is not your story anymore, your trauma becomes a commodity that other people can kind of come in and comment on, and that can re-traumatize you. And again, I make a point of bringing this up now because I was doing this for 20 years before anybody pulled me aside and said, I see what you're working on right now, and I want you to consider that this may re-traumatize you by putting it out there. And because somebody gave me that kindness, I want to give it to you. Just because it's a juicy story does not mean you have to tell the world. And just because it's a juicy story that you have the impulse to tell the world doesn't mean you need to do it right now. Just, you know, I think it's been my experience that a lot of us, like super hardworking types who've been used to doing it on our own, we want to take the harder way. And the harder way is not always the best way. And again, that was something that another writer who specializes in writing about their own life shared in a class, and I'm kind of paying it forward. You know, the hardest way is not always the best way. If you want to write it as fiction, go for it. If you want to report upon the topic, but not include your own story because it feels too vulnerable or it may piss off your family, it's okay to not want to publish something because it'll piss off your family. That's totally fine. We have this sort of weird all or nothing. I'm a writer, so I must, you know, take all the weird risks. Right. That's not true. You can do this half measure. You can write about, you know, sexual harassment in high school sports and not necessarily put your own story about your creepy basketball coach in there. Because if it feels too vulnerable, then maybe it is too vulnerable, and that's fine, because you can still cover the same territory as a writer in a way that does not put you psychically at risk. And this is me being real. You know, the whole like you have to bleed across the page thing, I'm not for it. It's not worth blowing up your life or your psyche to get a byline. It's just not.
You know what though, Lily? I mean, I'm interviewing you, right, for my class, but I mean, I just feel like you're speaking to me and others, but I'm going to be selfish for a minute, you know,
I like that.
Because that is true. And I think, especially in writing nonfiction and memoir type of pieces, that, you know, depending on, you know, what classes you took or what school you went to, you know, if you went in with the goal of publishing, you know, that was your goal, I'm going to publish this story, and you kind of get caught in this, God, I don't even know this, for me anyway, it was just like this publishing cycle where, what else can I think of? What else can I write? What else can I tell them? You know, because I'm over it, right? Because I can write about it. And then, like you said, exactly what happens, you end up re-traumatizing before you realize that that's what you've done or what you're doing. And I think I'm only, you know, 10, 15 years in, and you might be the first person that has ever said that to me, you know, just to slow down and really kind of process. I think once you know you can publish, I think at least for me in the beginning, it's like, will anybody want to buy it? Will anybody care?
Yeah.
Will anybody read it? I think once you know, okay, yes, that can happen, that likely will happen, but then should it happen? Like you said, you know, and I always tell my students and my kids, just because you can doesn't mean you should. It's the same kind of a philosophy.
Yeah.
With something like this, I think, you know, once you, Lily, decide what your next thing is going to be, I think it's definitely in this realm of, you know, mental wellness, self-care, being aware, teaching, whatever, because you're such a, you know, and then you have the faith, you know, aspect too, you know, that you write about. I think you're the perfect person to speak.
Oh, thanks.
However you do it, whether it's in a book or, if you become the next, Brene Brown, right? Or
Gotta get more scarves. She's all got good scarf going on.
But I mean, I just love that you're saying that, because we're all, it's like content, in this class, content, we're looking, what content do we have? What content can we put out? What content, how can we turn this into content? It's all content. And so if we use ourselves as content, that can be very dangerous, very scary. You don't ever want to put out something that you regret, because you can't take it back, because it's literally there forever, right? So I mean, I really appreciate you passing on what you learned, because I think that's really important. Like I said, you were talking and I'm just like, my gosh, she's talking to me. You know what I mean? I really feel that.
Well, I bring it up simply because all this is new to me too. I need you people to know, I got my first byline like 30 years ago, and I'm only now in the past couple of years, and I'm a human content form. I've written more than one memoir,
Right.
I've been on social media for like forever. And, so I am somebody who can speak with some real authority about like what it's like to take your life and go, ta-da, you're now content. Right. And I have definitely had to learn, because in the last, 5 to 10 years, with the ascension of the personal essay and the what somebody jokingly called the trauma industrial complex, of the sort of boom of people sharing these very, very personal stories.
Yes.
The temptation is always there, right? To look for the next juicy angle for your own self.
Right.
And there just needs to be that built-in layer of contemplation of, like you said, just because I can doesn't mean that I should. I don't know. Let me think about it.
Right.
I put this out there because I just want people to understand that these are difficult choices, and they're real choices. Sometimes you do have to make decisions. There's certain aspects of my life that I had to say, I could probably get good money for telling the story, but it would blow up a friendship, or it might hurt my daughter, or I don't want to read about this in print because it's painful to me, or whatever. And, it's not all fair game. And it really takes patience with yourself and discernment and self-understanding to go, I don't want to, because if 100 things about yourself are marketable as content, there may be a good 75% of that stuff that you just don't want to. And that's okay, because we live in this huge world of all kinds of angles we can explore and write about. And if we just are patient with ourselves and admit that you may have 5 friends who want to write about that exact subject and they're totally comfortable with it, if it's not okay for you, that's totally fine. I have lots of colleagues who write very, very personal stuff about, as an example, like about their sex lives. Like, I think Melissa Febos's Girlhood completely rocked my world. Incredible book, but about a lot of ways that she was really grappling with issues of consent as an adolescent, as a teenager, ways that we would, consider her, just dealing with boys and pushy boy sexuality, and how, it's a crucible every girl has gone through.
Right,
she,
right.
Very honest, very incredibly written. And also I read it also knowing that I could never write something that intimate about that part of my life. And, it's okay for her and not okay for me. And maybe there's somebody who's sort of in between the two, who could write a little bit more personally than I could, but not as personal as her. And then there's somebody beyond that who could write something incredibly graphic, and that's all okay. But our responsibility to ourselves as writers is to treat ourselves as people first, right? That if there's an internal no, and that anxiety is not just stage fright, but it's really like a heartsick feeling, or a stomach ache, or a headache, or wherever you manifest your body trying to tell you no, listen to it. Because like you said, once it's out there, you can't take it back. And this is internet culture, baby. There are things that I wrote 30 years, 25 years ago that I just thought would evaporate in the ethers, that thankfully have, that I would never write today, knowing that they're going to be around. Because, my friend who's an Army spouse, which, as you know, is a fairly conservative culture, she writes in a fairly uninhibited way. And she had, young children, and then they got older, and her daughter first learned how to Google her mother's name when she was 7. So, she had to really quickly think like, this is forever. This isn't a stack of magazines that you can shove in an attic. And that's okay to go, I don't know if I want to look at this in the face, when my own son learns how to Google when he's 6 or whatever the new age is.
Right.
It's perfectly okay to keep some things off the table. That said, what of yourself that you are happy to give, feel okay about giving, the world needs your voice. If you are coming from anywhere outside the ivory tower, if you are coming from the working class, if you are coming from a non-heterosexual place, if you are coming from non-traditional marriage, if you've been married more than once, if you had your kids on your own, if you are a single parent, these are all vital contributions, because we have this hegemonic view of the truth, of reality, and it's garbage. We need you. The second biggest problem after inertia issues for writers is the self-doubt of, is my story needed? But I can tell you, if you are the audience for Sharisse and you're being taught by Sharisse, your story is desperately needed, because we haven't heard from you yet. And so I want to offer you that encouragement that as a writer, because we're just weird, and writers are just weird people, you are always going to doubt yourself. I have been in the audience of people at Ivy League universities talking about their best-selling book, and they are still like, oh, I don't know if the world needs this. It's like, honey, how much more proof do you need? So
I know,
it's
right?
Endemic to the race. We are just weird people who, I think, because as writers, we go through the world constantly telling stories. We also tell ourselves stories, and our stories tend to be a little bit on the negative side, just because it's the nature of the beast. So yes, allow me to encourage you and remind you that because of where you are precisely in this moment, and because this is the way you're learning about writing, your story is vital to broadening people's sense of the world. So please.
Well, you know what? I'm going to comment on that just briefly, and then ask you about the mental illness that you wrote about.
Yeah.
But I once had, excuse me, I once had an editor tell me that I had this uncanny, and she used a far better word, but I'm going to use uncanny, ability to remember all things negative, everything bad, like just, with the detail that just, it happened yesterday. We're talking, 20, 30 years ago, 40 years ago things. But I have a really difficult time remembering something from last week, something very positive. And I really had to sit with that, Lily, because I thought, my gosh, I never thought about it that way. I don't know what that means, but I just know it's not that good things haven't happened, because certainly they have and are and continue, but I don't remember them in the same way I remember a hurt, a trauma, something that forever changed me. And so I thought, because I had that ability to remember in that way with that detail, because as you said, and we've talked about, I've had people come back, how could you remember what happened when you were 10 and blah, 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 blah. It's like,
try me, right? Try me.
I do. And I have a really, which I won't go into, but my mother helps me with those. She helps to fill in those gaps for me, for those things that I don't remember, because she's 77 years old, but she remembers literally everything. I don't know how she, so in the writing that would help, but I just wanted to just kind of throw that in. But with regard to the mental illness and the piece that you wrote that did better than you probably thought, you had so many more eyes on it. Do you think that piece came about because of COVID, or because of maybe dealing with certain issues during COVID, the way that we all had to deal with whatever we were dealing with during COVID? Or do you think that would have come about and you would have written about that topic without the pandemic? I
don't think so. I think the pandemic, this is like a pro tip, right? Like if any of you need a story idea, think about some way that COVID impacted your life, because what that is a community experience. Unlike many other times in history, literally everybody in the world went through this at the same time. And that actually is appealing to editors because it brings a certain universality. And what you can do is bring in your own experience of, you know, somebody died, or I lost a friend, or I gained a lot of weight, or I couldn't eat, or in my case, what happened with the pandemic was March 13th, 2020, my daughter was sent to remote learning at home. And what I found was I could not do the thing of supervising her on the computer, trying to do my thing, making sure my husband was okay working upstairs, keeping the house running to the extent that that's my gig. Mm-hmm. And it created this perfect storm of ways that I was just failing on every single front. And I knew it wasn't stress. I was just like, I know this is stressful, but I've been able to operate under all kinds of stress before. But what I can't do is this insane nouveau multitasking. And I had talked to a friend a couple of years ago about attention deficit disorder. And I was like, I don't know. I know what my finances are doing at all times. I can find my keys. I couldn't possibly have ADHD. And then I was like, oh, dang, maybe this is what it is. Cause I am like trying to juggle, and I'm dropping every ball. And what happened was COVID with my daughter at home created the perfect tableau of every way that my ADHD shows up, which is increased stress of the situation and having to do like 5 or 6 administrative things at once. I can do one thing, which is very typical of ADHD. It's called hyperfocus. I can write a book in 6 months, but I can't do my dishes. So it's like it's one or the other. But with the conditions of homeschooling and COVID, it was like being in the middle of a carnival midway, just like the barker and the juggler and the Ferris wheel and the dogs and the kids and the French fries and just everything at once.
Right.
Every ball fell out of the air at once and hit the ground. And I was like, I'm going to call me the medical treatment facility for behavioral health, and went through the questionnaire about COVID. ADHD because of COVID. Mm-hmm. Creating the conditions under which my inattentiveness became undeniable. Mm-hmm. Because I have, it's called masking, where you unconsciously or consciously adapt to be able to function because of your neurodiverse, the way your brain works. Like I instinctively went freelance and worked on my own so I could create my own hours. I instinctively chose work where I didn't have to be in a lot of meetings because I find them boring and I zone out. I instinctively wear the same thing every day so I don't have to go crazy trying to, create different outfits, which I can't do. I instinctively wear like the same 3 types of clothing because I have ADHD related sensory issues. So I gravitate towards certain fabrics, blah, blah, blah. So here I was in this daily life where I had no control over how my day was going to go. And it went to crap immediately. I was like, I got to function. I got to find a way to function. So called the lovely Army psychiatrist. Guy had me on the phone for like an hour, which for a person with ADHD is incredibly stressful. I was just like, this is boring. When does this end? Anyway, so finally it was over. He asked me all the questions. And I was just like, I want to text right now because I'm like always on the phone and my computer at the same time. So when the call gets anyway, so totally. So anyway, after the agonizing hour, he's like, yeah, my dude, let's get you some meds. And it was really weird. It was simultaneously a relief and mournful to get that diagnosis. On one hand, the relief was he believed me, which is fabulous. Not always the case with women and doctors. Right. And also the relief was available that I could get medication to at least try. Right. To make me function more effectively. But then it was mournful because I immediately sort of looked back over my whole life and saw ways that had I gotten a diagnosis earlier, I didn't finish high school. I'm sure ADHD had something to do with it. I never really had a, desk job because I just couldn't handle the tedium. I'm sure that had something to do with ADHD. And for me, it was kind of like when I got a PTSD diagnosis of like, it helps you, it reframes your whole life. Right. And I wanted to just circle back to what you said about your memory. of being so specific of looking at negative. It's actually a phenomena in trauma survivors, which many of us hardworking people are, called filtering for negative. And we filter for negative because that's how we survive. This little amygdala part of our brain just goes through and remembers. Partly it remembers so specifically because when the brain we're in a threatening situation, the brain just becomes hyper aware. Right. But it also gets stored in our memory the same way, partly so we can avoid the situation again. So if we're triggered, we're like, oh, danger, danger. We can, our little tiny amygdala takes over to keep us safe. But yeah, particularly if it's complex post-traumatic disorder, if you had a chaotic family life where it's daily, you just filter for negative because you're always looking for the threat. Just the way we're programmed. It's how we survive. And that's why we survive, Sharisse. I mean, it is a sick thing to say that it's such a blessing because it's kept us alive.
Right.
So anyway, I just wanted to circle back, and I'm sure there are many people watching this who grew up in homes that, even if they were very loving homes, had a lot of chaos.
Right.
And it's part of why we're, scrappers and strivers and want to succeed and prevail to, we're just trained to be survivors. And part of being a survivor is your brain is literally wired that way. The good news story I want to share with all your students is that a lovely writer who I consider a mentor said, if these problems that you've had are making it problematic for you to write, problematize the writing itself. Incorporate that problem into your writing. That is to say, as an example, I don't write very well sometimes because the ADHD just keeps me so distracted and I'm so caught up in the negative thinking and filtering for negative because of my trauma. I don't want to go ahead and keep writing because I feel very depressed about it or whatever. It's like, he's like, use that, my dude. Take that and put that in the piece. Like, it can kind of make the piece become something else. And I think engaging that advice and using it for the piece that I wrote about getting that ADD diagnosis, of putting it in there, being like, really realizing that I use the problem of feeling like such a failure to inform the piece and mentioning that. And I think that's what a lot of people related to is one thing we don't talk about. It's like, on one hand, we know objectively, this brain knows that you can't really blame yourself. It's the way your brain is. You're depressed, you're anxious, you have, you're not neurotypical or you're neurodiverse, whatever. It's wiring, right? But I said in the piece, it has taken me a lot to realize that, the way that my life course has been is a matter of faulty wiring, not personal failing. And I think that struck a bell for a lot of people, because I think a lot of us feel that way, that feeling of, I'm a loser, I'm a failure. And it's not, it's just wiring, but that doesn't mean that feeling isn't real. So I was like, let me put it in there and see if it resonates. And it did. So it was kind of a nice moment of seeing the payoff of somebody's advice to me. So yes, by all means, engage your problems in the writing itself, because it can often make it so much more rich than you could have anticipated, because people don't necessarily want to hear your perfect story. They want to hear how you sort of fought your way to a happy ending or a not miserable ending. And just want to be with you. And so the tendency to self-center because we want to make ourselves look a little bit better is a very understandable self-protection mechanism. But if you can just show a little bit more of that vulnerability and include the problem, I think that you might find that you take your writing to a whole other level. And just experimentally, and if it feels like crap, don't publish it.
You know what? I thought that that's so funny that you said March 13th, 2020, like, the date, right?
Oh, totally.
I felt like when the first day when COVID got really bad here in New York, I mean, you're here with me, so the time. It was the week before spring break for SUNY, and I'm looking forward to just, chilling for the week. My daughter's in school, I'm going to just relax. It's going to be my me time. And then we find out Friday at 4:00 that we're not coming back,
Right.
And I'm just me being selfish, because that's how I am sometimes. Everybody's going to be home during my spring break. Like, I had plans to do me. I had to do nothing during spring break. And now everybody's going to be home. And I just was really mad about that at first. And it reminded me of my days back at West Point when we would have a code red and my kids couldn't go to CDC and I had plans to write. And I'm like, well, I can't write with a 3-year-old and what am I,
Right.
Just a very selfish thought at first, because it's like, this is my time. I really was looking forward to this time. And now I have to share this time with everyone.
Right.
So the beginning of COVID for me was like that, like, how am I going to function and do the things that I need to do? Because I was still working remotely once
Right.
the break was over. How am I going to work now? Like you said, my daughter's at home now. I had a very similar kind of experiences to what you mentioned, with feeling like I just could not. How can I be at home and be failing? How can I not have to get up and commute and be failing? How can I not have to get dressed, the same way and still be failing? How is my daughter not doing as well in school and she's literally on the other side of this wall? Like, what the hell, So a lot of things came out of COVID for me, just like I'm sure for all of us. And I think your writing just helps to see that and helps to allow us to look at ourselves and think, okay, no, we're not tripping, we're not bugging. Like, these things happen, they can manifest in so many ways, and it's okay.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite pieces of writing that came out of COVID was Emily McCombs just recently went back to work. She works for the Huffington Post. She does their personal stories vertical, which is so lovely and has brought so many incredible first-person pieces to the reading public. And she wrote a piece about like coming back to work because, during COVID, when she was working at home, she gained 70 pounds. And it's like, I gained 45 pounds during COVID. And it was like so amazing to just read like this piece. It wasn't like, I'm going to be totally body positive and be like, woo, I changed, I'm cool. But she wasn't like, I feel so sad, I'm going to run off and do a post-COVID diet. It was just like reckoning, like, here's what it's like. And she also said very explicitly in the piece, I do not care to hear your thoughts about my weight loss or my weight gain. Thank you. Just FYI. Gonna bracket that, underline it in red. But I just loved it because it was such a just a report from the trenches of how COVID changed me personally, pluses, minuses, and ta-da, here we are. And, I found I've enjoyed reading all these sort of personal experiences of the pandemic because it's been so varied. Like for us, we had that sort of intense sense of claustrophobia of everybody's home. And again, in the writer weirdness, we really like our space. Like it's not even like it's not like we don't want you in the room. It's like, no, we actually technically don't want you in the house. Like we really want you to leave that because I can hear you breathing through the walls. Anyway, but then I have a very dear friend who was like alone for all of COVID and, was in their apartment, just, completely staying in all the time in the very beginning when there was no vaccines and we thought, you could get it just by touching a doorknob or whatever.
Right.
And the opposite extreme, right? Of just being so isolated and so desperate for touch and so lonely. And we all went through our intense crap, right? Just really were confronted with this new reality. Right. And I really think that I truly believe that COVID is going to be informing people's writing for a long time. I mean, for one thing, it's not over. I think for people right now with chronic illness and compromised immunity are ripe for material because so many people are acting like the pandemic is over and acting in very inconsiderate ways from a public health standpoint. Yes. So they are experiencing this in ways that is troubling because they're seeing that so many people don't care anymore. But yeah, I think it's just something that like 9/11 times a million, right? In terms of the ongoing ripple effect and domino effect of the ways that it has changed people's lives. And there's more to come.
I mean, because it is truly our collective experience. I mean,
this is like a world war.
For how many? I mean, from ages what? I mean, I have a grandson whom I just adore. He's in California. He's 2. And so I call him a COVID baby. I mean, so even from the little ones that are going to remember, this walking around with maybe a little mask on or, being home when mom might not have been home before, whatever their experience from that young to whomever, right? We all went through this. Like you said, we're all still going through this. I got so annoyed the other day. I was watching the news here in New York and they were talking about the St. Patrick's Day parade. It was delayed. And it finally, they had it that Monday or whatever. And someone that shouldn't have said on the news, well, now that the pandemic is over. And lady, like, oh, no, the pandemic is not over. But the fact that you said that, you're at this parade, you're in a uniform, people are paying attention to you. Someone's going to say, well, hey, she said the pandemic's over, it feels better, and now I don't have to wear my mask, or I don't have to get vaccinated, or whatever. And not even to get into that mess, but just, I thought, no, who thinks it's over? Who really thinks it's over?
Right.
But anywho, that's another, don't get me started on that, you know. I mean, I have my first cold, which I think is why I don't know, part of why we rescheduled my first cold in a couple of years. And I mean, and I wear 2 masks, you know, I'm constantly cleaning and sanitizing and using whatever, but I still was able to get sick, you know. And so I thought that, like, things are out there and I don't want them. And I'm
my daughter, they were able to take off masks a little earlier this year at school. So they did. And then she immediately got her first cold, because when she went back to school in April of 2021, you know, they were masked the whole time. They were masked at the beginning of this school year. So she didn't have any of the first grader crud. And now, of course, second grade,
she's getting everything.
Got colds, and we're back. Yeah, it's, you know, it's an interesting time, and it does present to people who are looking for an avenue in which to enter a story. You know, drawing on something COVID related gives them a bit of an advantage because it is a collective experience, and then you can personalize it from there.
Right.
So,
right.
You know,
and here I just thought from a writing perspective, but I mean, you probably know better that maybe people wouldn't want to read about COVID anymore, but it's just, you know, I kind of guess it depends on the story and what you're saying.
Absolutely.
You know?
Yeah, I mean, there's always, you know, I would never take a particular topic off the table just because of what the topic is, because a friend of mine from many years ago who went on to win an Oscar for their screenwriting gave me this amazing piece of advice, like many years ago, before anybody knew who they were. He's like, it's the writing, stupid. I'm like, exactly, it's the writing, stupid. It's not so much the topic as it is, you know, what you bring to it. So you may have some COVID story that's kind of hilarious, or a COVID story that's, you know, touching or mushy, or you may have decided to leave a horrible marriage, and it might be somewhat of an empowerment story. So there's always a way. It's never the topic itself that's forbidden. Yeah,
right.
For sure.
No, I mean, I love that. I'm glad that you said that. Not me personally trying to sell a story, but just thinking about it. Like, I think it's just because, I mean, this is a personal thing. The other day, an editor told me I had wrote something that was related to Will Smith and Chris Rock, but really not, right? But that's what kind of got me to thinking. And I knew in trying to pitch it, I had to tell them, okay, I know that this is kind of played out. People are tired of hearing about the slap, but you know, here's my angle. And I really thought it was a good piece. And they're just like, no, we're over the slap. And then I go turn on my computer, and there's like 15 more, you know, stories similar, related, still on TV, and all these kinds of things. And I just thought, well, I guess it just depends on that particular publication or that editor, if they're over that thing, right?
Totally. Yeah.
You know, because I still thought it was a good story, and I'll still try to pitch it. But anyway.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most truly the most helpful bit of information I've ever gotten from a colleague is a writer who, in writing about her experience as a writer of nonfiction largely, wrote in a piece in the New York Times. She's like, I get rejected every day. I was like, dang, really? Because I don't pitch every day, for one thing. But it was so helpful for me as a writer who gets discouraged by rejection so easily. See that this is somebody who is leagues beyond me in terms of just like output. That even they, who I view as such a star, she's like, no, I get rejected all the time. She's like, for every one story you see, there's like 5 or 6 no. I'm like, I bear that in mind, because this is somebody who publishes a lot. And even at that level, you're still getting like, no, I'm over this topic, or I don't like the angle, or, you know, the story mentions the color yellow and I don't like it. You know, it's very arbitrary, but it's so hard, right? Even if it's not a personal story, it's still your work, and it's hard to get rejected. So to read that, you know, we only see the wins, right? We only see the pieces that end up published. We don't see the road to publication. And I should say that one of my more successful pieces that ended up in the Times got rejected 6 times before I found a home for it in the Times. So even for me, it helps to remember, even in my own life, that it ain't over just because one person rejected it.
Right.
And rejection is such a constant. You can't outrun it. You can't avoid it. You can't undo it. You can only like adjust your own relationship to it.
Right.
So like, you know, just like get your rejection, drink a soda, take a walk, pet your cat, say catty things about the editor under your breath, but not an email. Do whatever you got to do to kind of restabilize and just like, you know, pick yourself up and keep going, because it is, it's just more common than I thought. I always just thought that people who I admired, like they pitched it once and it got swept up to the heavens and trumpeted out by angels. And it's really not true. It is just, it's everywhere. It's like, you know, dandelions or fungus or COVID. It's just, it's part of the package.
Well, and I love that. I mean, and we can probably end there, because that whole just notion of just keep going. That, I mean, it's just, it's so simple. It sounds like it just rolls off your tongue, like you don't even think about it. But I mean, really, that's really what we have to do. Like, we don't really have a choice, the way I see it.
If you have that drive inside you to write, you're a writer. Being a writer is not like being a doctor or being an attorney. You don't have to be accredited and go through this educational gauntlet to get the piece of paper to certify what you do. It's more like being a runner. If you run, you're a runner. If you write, you're a writer. And the only way to stop being a writer is to quit.
Stop writing.
Up to you. And also you can quit and come back, by the way. It's not like the door. Yeah, you know, if you're writing, you're a writer. Nobody can take that away from you, no matter who they are. Sorry, it's just the way it is. I don't make the rules, I just report them. If you're writing, you're a writer. Godspeed.
Well, Lily said it, so that makes it true. That makes it final. That's it. You said it. If you're a writer, I mean, if you write, you're a writer. I love it. Okay, so class, like I said, Lily's bio is in our classroom. All of her social media platforms will be there as well. And, you know, feel free to reach out and just let her know that you were introduced to her from Zooming In with Professor Smith.